Good morning and good evening. I would like to welcome you to the third and final Zoom session for the Symposium, The Sanctuary, Art and Literature from Exile and Hermitage, conceived on the occasion of Villa Aurora's 25th anniversary. To begin, I would like to thank our sponsors and partners, the German Federal Foreign Office, the Berlin Senate, the Friedrich Springer Foundation, and the University of Southern California, as well as the teams at Villa Aurora in Los Angeles and Berlin. The presentation, 25 Years of Literature from the Villa Aurora, a Sanctuary of Exile and a Gateway to California by Stefan Kepler-Tasaki of the University of Tokyo, started us out on this journey. And after this introduction into the topic, we had the honor to welcome back three former writers in residence, namely Kevin Bennemann from 2008, Tanja Dückers from 2000, and Felicitas Hoppe from 2012, who shared very personal reflections on the concept of sanctuary. If you have not been able to attend these presentations, I would very much encourage you to seek them out online once they become available on our YouTube channel. And that should be from November 19th on. As we conclude our mostly virtual, unfortunately, symposium, we are circling back to academia today with a lecture by Annette Jael Lehmann entitled From the Secret Wing on the Move, Multidirections of Doing Literature. And now I have the pleasure of introducing Friederike von Schwerin-High, who has kindly agreed to be our moderator for today. Friederike von Schwerin-High is a professor of German and chair of German and Russian at Lehmann-Kolesch. She received her PhD in comparative literature from the University of Massachusetts, Amherst. She's the author of a book entitled Shakespeare, Reception and Translation, Germany and Japan, and of multiple scholarly articles on Gotthold Ephraim Lessing, Goethe, Thomas Mann, and many other topics from the field of German literature. Together with Roswitha Berwick, she co-edited the journal Pacific Coast Philology for 6 years, and her research interests include the rhetoric of biography and works of fiction, concepts of friendship and otherness, and the history of blank verse in 18th century German drama text. Thank you very much, Friederike, for being our moderator today.
Thank you so much, Dr. Gordon, and happy 25th birthday, Villa Aurora. It is my great honor to introduce today's speaker, Professor Annette Lehmann, and to welcome you all to the fourth part of the symposium, The Sanctuary, Art and Literature from Exile and Hermitage. Professor Lehmann is a professor of theater and visual culture at the Freie Universität Berlin. She holds a doctorate and habilitation in comparative literature from the Freie Universität. She is also closely connected to Southern California, having been a fellow at the Huntington and the Getty, and having taught at UCLA, Cal Arts, and USC. Her long list of accomplishments and awards has included research stays at the University of Jerusalem, at the Mahindra Humanities Center at Harvard, and being leading investigator at Einstein Center Digital Future and the Excellence Cluster Temporal Communities Doing Literature in a Global Perspective. Professor Lehmann's research has focused on visual culture and performance studies, modern, avant-garde, contemporary, and new media art, knowledge transfer, and digital knowledge design. Her numerous publications include monographs on Nelly Sachs and Rosa Ausländer, on new media and aesthetic paradigms since the 1960s, on visual culture and performance in 19th century America, and on Black Mountain practice-based research. Her most recent book is entitled Art Projects, Performance, Exhibition, and Event. The title of her lecture today is Secret Wing, On the Move, Multidirections of Doing Literature. Just a few points of housekeeping for the hour that we will be spending together today. Professor Lehmann's lecture will run approximately 40 minutes. We will have a Q&A session immediately following the lecture. And please put your questions in the chat or in the dialog box that appeared when you first signed when you first register. Once again, please join me in welcoming Professor Lehmann, and Annette, please take it away.
Thank you so much for this wonderful and kind introduction. I really feel honored. It's a very emotional place for me to be invited to, because like in the beginning of my research career, I was really very much focusing my attention to that part of history. I started out my master. I did that with a very famous German professor, Ebert Lemmert. I was very young. And it was like on Thomas Mann's political speeches in the United States. But that was really a long time ago, more than 20, 25 years ago. So anyways, it's kind of a wonderful, opportunity for me to return. And I have to warn you, it's not a strictly academic talk I'm, trying to unfold today. And I wanted to dedicate this talk to my very, very close friend, Andrew Hewitt, who was a professor at UCLA in the German department and who tragically died in the year of 2019. So I start. From the Secret Wing, On the Move, Multi-Directions of Doing Literature, Preface. My contribution to the Symposium, The Sanctuary, Art and Literature from Exile and Hermitage, is a logbook of research diary of 14 days between October 27th and November 9th, 2021. It engages in the question of writing in and as exile as a way to enact the relation between vulnerability and belonging. I argue that vulnerability is a condition of writing in and as exile, and as such is also an action performed by corporeal subjects. Despite of the fact that this writing takes place on contested territory, a fact that foregrounds displacement and diaspora, encompassing nomadic movement and exposing deterritorialization, it also depends on belonging, on sharing a place with others as a safeguard, maybe as a sanctuary or a multi-layered mesh of relational surroundings. I work on the basis that this relation of writing and belonging in exile is a particularly tricky one. 27th October, sanctuary. A sanctuary is a spatial metaphor for a place where someone or something is protected or given shelter. It is a place from danger or difficult situation. It is a place of safety. I do a little research on the word sanctuary on Google. I land on a website titled, Welcome to the Crossword Solver. The answers I find there are puzzling. Clue, place of protected of refuge, sanctuary. Clue, place of refuge, sanctuary, heaven, sanctuary. And even more stimulating, quote, we hope that the following list of synonyms for the word sanctuary will help you to finish your crossword today. We've arranged the synonyms in length of order so that it is easier to find. So far, so good. The following definition, however, is challenging. Definition of sanctuary. Quote, a consecrated place where sacred objects are kept. 28th of October, a move in many directions. To start my inquiry a bit more properly, I tried to pose a heuristic research question. I tried to formulate an initial version. Thus, writing in and as exile encourage a recognizability of vulnerability and, as such, creates a possibility for empowerment. I will approach this question from one angle. Does this writing unfold as a constant movement, opening a wide circle of belonging, intertwining lives and times together in a shared vulnerability and a shared memory, overcoming the binaries of inclusions and exclusions or misrecognition? In other words, and maybe more broadly, can we rethink vulnerability as a possibility for empowerment? Approaching this question today, I'm going to read Judith Butler's essay, Rethinking Vulnerability and Resistance, from the year 2016. In this essay, vulnerability is reframed not as a need for protection or a safe space, but as a very ground for resistance. Butler states, quote, vulnerability is not exactly overcome by resistance, but becomes a potentially effective mobilizing force in potential political mobilizations. And she continues, once groups are marked as vulnerable within human rights discourse or legal regimes, those groups become reified as definitionally vulnerable, fixed in a political position of powerlessness and lack of agency. Butler's concept opposes traditional understandings of vulnerability that link it to passivity and inactivity. Quote, once we understand the way that vulnerability enters into agency, then our understanding of both terms can change and the binary opposition between them can become undone, end of quote. Consequently, the relationality and interdependency of both makes it a site of political agency. Writing in an exile condition is mobilized from that shared experience of inhabiting complex physical and emotional vulnerabilities, and further, exile constitutes the ground of vulnerability as its ontological and existential condition. Writing in and as exile constitutes and manifests itself in various forms of empowerment and resistance and emergence, nevertheless, not only despite vulnerability, but precisely because of it. 29th of October, exile and ostracism. The theme of exile appears commonly in Greek tragedy. The motif reached its peak in Euripides' tragedy Medea, written in the 5th century BC. In Euripides' Medea, exile is simultaneously a past reality, an impending threat, and an internal state. Medea and Jason are exiles before the action of Euripides' plays even begins. In the play's backstory, Medea was forced to flee from her homeland of Colchis for helping Jason to secure the Golden Fleece. But also in the play, exile, or Medea's impending exile, is one of the main forces of the plot. But exile, beyond being a physical condition for Medea, Jason, and her household, is also an emotional and affective state. Both Medea and Jason invoke their exile status in their arguments, and Jason even tries to convince Medea that she should consider herself most lucky that exile is her punishment rather than death. For both Jason and Medea, the pain of present exile, coupled with fear of future ones, serves as a motivation and justification for their actions in the play. Their position is constantly vulnerable. Exile in ancient times is closely connected with ostracism, which was a procedure in the city-state of Athens in which any citizen could be expelled for 10 years. Such a fate was decided through an Athenian democratic procedure, where pottery shards were used as voting tokens. According to Plutarch, this ostracism was considered valid if a total number of votes cast was at least 6,000. Because ostracism was carried out by thousands of people over many decades of an evolving political situation and culture, it did not serve a single monolithic purpose. While in some instances it was a clear expression of popular anger at the citizen, ostracism was often used preemptively. It was employed as a way of neutralizing someone thought to be a threat to the state and to the democracy or a potent tyrant. In more general terms, the most common form of ostracism is refusing to communicate with a person. This too can take many forms. Refused communication, a person is effectively ignored and excluded from a given community. Such is the fate of both internal and external exilees. 30th to 31st of October, Moria in Berlin or exile in Germany. Carlos Cedra was a Chilean writer who went into exile in the GDR in 1973. Moria in Berlin, the first of Cedra's 3 novels, was published in 1993. In this text, Cedra revisits the experience of exile and critically examines the conditions under which Chileans lived in the GDR and interacted with East German citizens. During the years of Pinochet's dictatorship, from 1973 until the middle of the 1980s, a considerable part of Chilean literature was written outside of the country by authors who had been dispersed all over the world. As a work of fiction about the GDR, the experiences of exile, Moria and Berlin stands out in several ways, because it is a literary inquiry in the contradictory experiences of belonging in this country of exile, mirrored in the conflicts that resulted from clashes between a repressive system of the GDR and the group of exilees who were both privileged and controlled, socially as well ideologically, most of them living in a ghetto framed by the regime as a sanctuary. The novel shows the constant double bind of coping with the political system and its repressions, as well as a contradictory loyalty of most Chilean exilees as a struggle for belonging. The first chapter of this novel ends in a retrospective statement written in italics by a narrative voice of Ghetto, describing the deep moral conflict of the Chilean exilees in the GDR, beginning with the words, "We are sinners." Their collective guilt as exilees, as political refugees and left-wing activists, was at the thought of having saved themselves while others, the martyrs, continued to fight and sacrifice their lives back home in Chile. From this backdrop, exile in East Germany is presented as a collective historical memory and a process of grieving about a conflicting experience, not only in the figures of loss and escape, but also as a conflict between belonging and political agency. 1st till 3rd of November, Where I Am is Germany, or Exile in the United States. I further inquire into the question of writing in and as exile in relation to belonging and agency, potentially in opposition to my initial hypothesis of vulnerability and empowerment. What if writing in exile follows a teleology of recognition and social inclusion based on stable, symbolic power relations that establish its own network of belonging? I come thus back to Thomas Mann's very effective strategy of self-monumentalization as a writer in exile. This can be exemplified by retelling one of his success stories. Quote, "Where I Am is Germany." Thomas Mann supposedly dictated these words on February 21st, 1938, the day of his arrival in New York, to the notepads of journalists who had been expecting the world-famous Nobel Prize winner. The reason for this journey on board of the Queen Mary was a lecture tour across America, which was to last from March 1st to May 6th, and led him from New York, Philadelphia, and Washington on the East Coast to Los Angeles and San Francisco on the West Coast, but also included cities like Kansas City, Chicago, and Cleveland. Thomas Mann went on stage as a speaker of a total of 15 times on this trip, usually wearing tailcoat, fancy leather shoes, and silk stockings. The audience varied depending on the size of the hall. Sometimes there were 2,000 people, or even as in Ann Arbor, Chicago, 4,000 to 4,500 listeners who had come to hear the German writer, whose accent was so to have to be so terrible at first that some remarked it would have been better if Thomas Mann had spoken in German, because then at least a few of those in the audience would have been able to understand him. After the lecture, Thomas Mann submitted himself to the ritual of, quote, squeezing out that was common in American lecture halls and often lamented in his diary, and answers questions from the audience with his daughter Erika and sometimes his wife Katja, both who would interpret for him. Afterwards, they usually went to a grand reception followed by a late dinner among local dignitaries. The honorarium for one of those events was quite impressive. It was supposed to be $15,000, which was about 3 times of the annual salary of an American professor at that time. In spring of 1938, an estimated total of about 43,000 Americans paid admission to listen to one of the 15 lectures by the German writer, who was advertised on posters and in newspapers ads as quote, the greatest living man of letters. But in exile, Thomas Mann incorporated above all something else. He was Germany. Interestingly enough, Thomas Mann's brother Heinrich Mann had noted in the same proclamation in his volume Ein Zeitalter wird besichtigt with a small but no means insignificant shift of meaning. Quote, wo ich bin, ist die deutsche Kultur. Where I am is German culture. 4th of November, Secret Wing 1, the case of Mariana Marin. While retelling the story of Thomas Mann over the last 3 days, I feel my research has hit a dead end. I'm stuck and I cannot move on. I return to the name of the maze, sanctuary. This very name might take me to the core of the problem enough to find a proper approach and a way out, but not directly via detour again. I come upon a new metaphor related to the sanctuary, the secret wing. I find this in an announcement for an exhibition soon to take place in Romania. I learn that the secret wing is a title of a volume of poetry by Mariana Marin, 1956 till 2003, one of the most emblematic and uncompromising authors of the 1980s generation in Romania. I assume that secret wing here is a metaphor encapsulating the tension and contradictions of arriving in an exile, permeated by an acute sense of loneliness and isolation. The metaphors of the sanctuary and the secret wing are related via responses to ostracism and different ways of coping with vulnerability by developing writing as a life tool for protection, empowerment, and resilience. Ostracism appears to be unique in threatening all four of the senses for basic human needs simultaneously. From a psychological perspective, the negative reactions to being ostracized are immediate and robust. After being ostracized for less than 5 minutes, individuals report less satisfaction of 4 fundamental needs: belonging, self-esteem, control, and meaningful existence, and higher levels of sadness and anger. For here, my information search on the secret wings becomes more tangible. It is more specifically a metaphor which takes as a starting point the idea that throughout the 1980s in Eastern Europe, inner and collective resources forged prolific intersections between exile and poetry. This decade is significant because having immediately preceded the reunification of Europe through the implosion and high concentration of artistic resources and moral resistance. In her Secret Wing poetry volume, Mariana Marin defines her own poetic example of resilience by identifying herself with Anne Frank's 2-year isolation experience in the secret annex of a canal house in Amsterdam, an identification which is obviously burdensome and questionable. However, affirming nothing but poetry as a resource for reacting to being fundamentally ostracized and existentially threatened, Mariana Marin articulates as a resilient mode of poetic thinking by imagining her own secret wing, a form of inner architecture where self discovers profound resources of poetic expressions in resonance with collective history. This triggers my speculative curiosity. Does the metaphor of the secret wing connotate the topological dimension of a palace and an imaginary space of belonging for topographic writing? Or does it even articulate to the other meaning of wing as a part of a body that enables to move up and down and allows it to fly, as a metaphor for poetic writing as lifting and transcending force? Unfortunately, I cannot find Secret Wing in the German or English translation, and biographical accounts on Mariana Marin are scarce. I only learned that she was prohibited from publishing by the Romanian regime until the 1990s and spent 6 months in Berlin in the year of 2000 before dying in loneliness and misery in the year of 2003. 5th of November, Hélène Sixou's book, The Exile of James Joyce, in brackets, almost 800 pages long, a book she later described as dissertation. I take another detour, hoping to understand the entanglements between writing and as exile and the biographical practice of something tentatively called life writing or testimonial. But my first approach leads to other conclusions. Helene Sixois's development as a writer revolves around the motifs of exile as an autobiographical source in which she pushes and blurs the boundaries between autobiography, literary criticism, and biographical subjects. In other words, she writes and rewrites James Joyce through her own complex experiences of exile. The aesthetic, epistemological, ethical, and political dimension of writing in exile becomes her method of autobiopoiesis. As a result, her writing initially becomes a creative, interpretive, and hybrid process where the biographical account is entangled with epistemological, psychological, textual problems implicit in the relationship between the biographer and the biographical subject. Her exile in Algeria leads Sixous to experience a sense of non-belonging to fixed identities such as nation or country, since it was during the time that she was exposed to a toxic mixture of colonial racism, imperialism, and anti-Semitism. Exile is an ambiguous and unstable place of non-belonging, and her writing both comes from and returns to this place of vulnerability. In The Exile of James Joyce, Sixous uses exile as a generative locus and metaphor of his and her writing and claims that this is, quote, more complex than simple exile of the artist who was driven out of society for not being like others, end of quote. Paradigmatically, exile is here the precondition for the possibility of writing, a writing with a strong autobiographical current, an act of autobiopoiesis. Although this concept resonates with the modernist motif of writing as a process of blurring art and life, it highlights the effective and subjective impact of the biographical entanglements of writing within the framework of exile. At the end of this week, I can at least vaguely hold on to the term autobiopoiesis as an epistemologically valuable term to indicate an undercurrent of empowerment and more or less sublime acknowledgement of vulnerability of writing in and as exile. 6th of November, Villa Aurova. Today, I have very little time to do more research on my contribution to this sanctuary conference. I feel weary on this typical gray morning in Berlin. I remember parts of a strange dream from last night. I was guest in a TV show contest with professors from German university departments in the United States. I was given a quiz question, quote, who wrote the best German diary in exile in the United States during the Second World War, Thomas Mann, Stefan Zweig, or Klaus Mann? I answer Leo Trotsky, and I'm expelled from the show. Waking up in the next morning, I Googled Trotsky's diary. I find an interesting anecdote. Trotsky claimed that during his 24 years in exile, in Mexico, by the way, 24 years in exile, his writing of a diary was his, quote, most significant achievement of my life. I recall that there were Trotskyists in California in those years, and of course, Thomas Mann, Klaus Mann, or even Leon Feuchtwanger weren't among them. This odd and contingent chains of clue finally directs me towards yet another coincidence during my research for this conference on the sanctuary. I find the main mention in Pacific Palisade, Los Angeles, called Villa Aurova. Perhaps this is unsurprising, of course. Villa Aurova is well known as a prominent meeting place for exiled German-speaking poets, writers, and intellectuals, but it was also a place of conflict between belonging and political agency. In late 1943, Leon Feuchtwanger and his wife bought the house for about the annual salary of a school teacher. Feuchtwanger wrote 6 historical novels in this place, but these were far from easy years for him. Feuchtwanger had glorified the Soviet Union and the dictatorship of Stalin in the book Moscow 1933, and even defended the show trials against Trotskyists, which later received strong disapproval from exiled colleagues like Franz Werfel and Stefan Zweig. In the early 1950s, during the McCarthy era, Feuchtwanger, as many others, was accused of communism, as was interrogated by the House of Un-American Activities Committee, fearing that he would not be readmitted if he traveled abroad. Feuchtwanger never left the United States after the war. In 1958, Feuchtwanger's application for American citizenship was finally granted, but the letter informing him of this decision only arrived the very day after his death. At this point, I'm coming to a sudden and full stop. It is already 6 p.m. and I realize I have not made any progress today. Despite of this, I have to finish and to rush to Mitte because I have tickets to see a new performance by Florentina Holzinger at the Volksbühne, accidentally called a divine comedy. I mean, you know that Dante wrote this when he was exiled in Florence, and he was writing it for many years. It was first called Commedia, but in the later Divine Comedy. 7th of November, Secret Wing 2, The Case of Anne Lister. Today is Sunday, and it will take some more time to continue my writing of the diaries of Anne Lister from the years 1821 to 1823. Anne Lister was a West Yorkshire diarist, leaving behind 26 handwritten volumes on her public and private life, containing an estimated 5 million words, partly in the Crifthand Code she devised for her most private reflections. These particular diaries were recognized by the UNESCO as a pivotal document in British history and were added to the Register of the UNESCO Memory of the World Programme in the year 2011. Taken as a whole, Lister's diaries represent the most sustained and thorough daily account in the known archive of life writing. They reveal how one non-conforming woman thoughtfully analyzed the social, economic, emotional, and sexual politics of her time. No detail was left out. The time she woke up and how long she slept, the letters she received and their contents, the day's weather, the time it took to walk into town, whether she enjoyed veal cutlets or mutton for dinner. At the time when women were not allowed at universities, everything she had learned that day would be recorded too. Greek, algebra, French, mathematics, geology, astronomy, and philosophy. Her observations include extended personal interaction with her tenants and local artists, engineering calculation, legal issues, and coal pit development, gentry responses to industrialization, and the political unrest it triggered, assessment of contemporary advances in geology, landscape design, and anatomy, theological reflection, medical opinions, and analysis of her own health, forensic descriptions of cities and landscapes and cultures across her many travels and years abroad. But most importantly, it tells a story that without her direct testimony might otherwise have seemed historically impossible. Indeed, she records extensive romantic and sexual engagement with a network of women. These range from what she termed scrapes with other women to a series of sustained love affairs and dual relationships, especially with her high-risk neighbor, Anne Walker. In her diaries, the word Felix, meaning Latin and happy in Latin, was frequently used to record their sexual encounters. Lister believed that her code, devised from Greek and Latin, mathematical symbols, punctuation, and the Zodiac, disguised her innermost thoughts and was completely indecipherable. Nevertheless, the code has been cracked by her descendant, John Lister, who lived from 1847 to 1993, the last resident at Chittenden Hall. Once he began to grasp its unprecedented sexual content, he was first tempted to burn the diaries, but later served them in a secret wing of his mansion. The diaries of Anne Lister are a striking example for an almost lifelong writing process in and as an inward turn and inner exile, establishing as testimonial as a secret and thereby safe location. This finds its metonymy in a secret wing as a hybrid space for writing conducted without an audience or reader in mind, relentless, unscrupulous, resilient, developing a communication technique that was supposed to foreclose communication, confining the words instead to silence, oblivion, and invisibility, all while being a strategy of survival, resistance, and empowerment. These diaries fit in a broader sense in the category of exile writings and are an unprecedented document for the revelation of a subject in writing, encoding an ongoing and intrinsic process of self-exile. 8th of November, vulnerability. I'm running out of time. I feel pressure to present something more coherent and academia conforming as a result on this topic. It is high time to further rethink the entanglement between writing in and as exile as empowerment and vulnerability from the angle of existential precariousness. If writing is essentially linked to vulnerability, it is a sensitive matter embedded and affecting. It exposes injustices and asymmetries and suggests that it may pervade the lived experience of all in a way differentiated in complexity, intensity, and outcome. Vulnerability is often closely related to the experience of violence and the limits of its representation. The ethical demands and limits of representation within divergent figurations of violence and vulnerability have been widely discussed. I would like to direct your attention to normative power regimes navigating the tensions, contradictions, and the common ground whose vulnerability is recognized and what the role of such recognitions plays. As Judith Butler has pointed out, recognizability determines, quote, who is entered into the category of the human in these times and who is considered inhuman, monstrous, or subhuman, end of quote. In Frames of War, Butler focuses on this existential dimension of the recognizability of vulnerability as expressed in the concept of grievability, leading to understanding that, quote, Butler, one depends on dominant norms regarding whose life is grievable and worth protecting and whose life is ungrievable or marginally or episodically grievable, and so, in that sense, already lost in part or in whole, and thus less worthy of protection and sustenance, end of quote. In accordance with Michael Foucault, Butler acknowledges that a particular regime of truth decides what or will not be recognizable a form of being. Those who appear to belong to, for instance, a quote, suspect ethnical group are perceived as less grievable and are thus less intelligible as vulnerable than other individuals or even objected as inhuman. Consequently, Butler suggests to shift the emphasis from the recognition of identities to the recognition of vulnerability, allowing to recognize lives as vulnerable lives and sharing vulnerability within a social cultural community. If writing in and as exile is a multi-layered practice unfolding as a multi-directional actualization in variegated contexts and situations, it has a potential to expose us to the vulnerability of life and extending it to shared vulnerability, touching upon the limits of the sable. And this writing in and as exile maps a deterritorialized cartography of becoming of an unfixable, quote, nomadic identity. In Rosie Baiardotti's words, quote, nomadic cartographies need to be redrafted constantly. As such, they are structurally opposed to fixity and therefore to precarious appropriation. The nomad has a shared sense of territory, but no possessiveness about it, end of quote, Baiardotti. From this backdrop, we may conclude that a sanctuary is a temporary safe space for exposing and exceeding vulnerabilities by disposing frames of recognition as nomadic appropriation. 9th of November, a list. My last entry on the subject is speculative and fragmentary again. My daily research ends with a contingent inventory, much like a lost and found. My intersections, explorations of writing as a nomadic movement of perpetual departure and non-arrival, as well as writing in and as exile as an existential act of exposing or hiding vulnerability, and where it began, at the thematic crossroads of the sanctuary. In a very basic sense, the sanctuary keeps on to what has been rescued. This is why I tentatively return to my quote from one of the definitions of the crossword. A sanctuary is, quote, a consecrated place where sacred objects are kept, end of quote. Indeed, this definition seems to be the least satisfying option for either a departure or arrival from my research. 9th of November. I feel a magnetic repulsion from that day. Consequently, I rummage online through an uncanny abundance of documents, writings, books, objects, and images revolving around this day and this historical and its historical ramifications. Focusing on the 9th of November opens a space for an immersive labyrinth of a collection of intertwined and tangled archival materials and documents, and of course, stories. Such a labyrinth creates pathways to end events, experiences, memories that might otherwise be inaccessible or lost. However, I have not much more to coherently present from this excavation. Today on my lost and found list, I count 14 items that do not fit into one distinctive category for reflection or analysis. Instead, it keeps my research unsettled enough to move in multiple directions. Here is the first and last item on my list. 1. A chalk drawing named Die verscheuchte Dichterin. Since 1974, Lasker Schüler's estate has been housed in the National Library of Israel in Jerusalem. It contains manuscripts of her works, drawings, correspondence with contemporaries, amongst them Shmuel Joseph Agnon, Hugo Bergmann, Gottfried Benn, Martin Buber, Albert Einstein, Thomas Mann, Max Reinhardt, Salman Schopen, and Ernst Simon. Among the artist's drawings is a chalk drawing pasted onto another piece of cardboard, a very small one, entitled Die verscheuchte Dichterin. The picture resonates with the interweaving of poetry and painting, but can also be seen as an allegory of Lasker Schüler's exiled existence. Onto the piece cardboard, which serves as a mount for the drawing, the poet transcribed part of a poem published in her first volume of poems, Styx, in 1902. Quote, wüsste ich einen Strom, wie mein Leben so tief flösse mit seinen Wassern. End of quote. In addition to this, Lasker Schüler wrote, quote, down in hospital 1935 because of injuries to the Nazi. On the drawing itself, she wrote in 1942, and summarizing again, 1935 to 1942. In the center of the picture are two human figures, a seated woman, her gaze lowered and her hands intertwined with those of another figure standing next to her. The former figure represents Lasker Schüler herself. The other figure, including headgear, confronts the woman whose body language expresses exhaustion and grief. 14, my 14th item, my last one. A letter about a traveling book. A special and rare testimony to the days of the November pogrom in 1938 is a letter written by a former Berliner, Felix Pinskower, to the writer Shmuel Agnon a few months after Pinskower's immigration to Palestine. In his letter to the great writer, Pinskower also enclosed a small book with the title Im Herzen der Meere, In the Heart of the Seas, in a Hebrew edition published by Schopen Verlag in Berlin. I would like to conclude quoting a few passages from this letter. I quote it in German and in English. Felix Pinskower wrote, ich wurde unfreiwillig Augenzeuge eines Vorganges, der sich unauslöschlich mein Gedächtnis eingeprägt hatte. Auf meinem Weg wurde ich durch einen großen Menschenauflauf aufgehalten und als ich mich in die Menge hineinzwängte, sah ich, wie eine jüdische Buchhandlung geplündert wurde. Da kamen die Schergen mit 9 Stößen Büchern auf die Straße, um sie unter Johlen und Schreien der Menge an der gleichen Stelle zu entladen. In diesem Moment wehte mit einem Windstoß ein kleines, unscheinbares Büchlein vor die Füße. Instinktiv griff ich danach und steckte es in meine Tasche. Am gleichen Tag wurde ich aufgrund der, in Anführungsstrichen, Vergeltungsaktion mit 1000 anderen Juden verhaftet und in ein Konzentrationslager gebracht. Nach 6 Wochen wurde ich aufgrund meines Auswanderungsantrags entlassen. Auf dem Schiffe fand ich endlich die lang ersehnte Ruhe und nahm das Buch zur Hand. Die Hasidim von Jilsowitz waren so lebensnah geschildert, dass man glaubte, in die Gegenwart versetzt zu sein. Das Buch wurde mir ein treuer Freund auf meiner Reise. Kreuzten nicht auch heute monatelang Schiffe das Meer, um Menschen nach Zion zu bringen? Immer wieder schlug ich einzelne Kapitel auf und stellte Vergleiche an mit der heutigen Zeit. Möge dieses Büchlein, das von Zion ausging, nach Zion zurückkehrt, ein Symbol für die Sammlung unseres verstreuten und von unwürdigen gewaltsam festgehaltenen Schrifttums wirken. In English translation. I became an involuntary eyewitness to an event that was indelibly imprinted on my memory. On my way, I was stopped by a large crowd of people and I was squeezed into the crowd. I saw a Jewish bookstore being looted. Then the henchmen came on the street with new piles of books to unload them in the same place, amid the jeering and shouting of the crowd. At that moment, with a gust of wind, a small, unconspicuous booklet blew at my feet. Instinctively, I grabbed it and put it in my pocket. On the same day, I was arrested along with thousands of other Jews on the basement of the, quote, reprisal action and taken into a concentration camp. After 6 weeks, I was released because of my application for immigration. On the ship, I finally found the long-awaited rest and took the book in hand. The Hasidim of Jilowitz were described so true to life that one believed to be transported to the present. The book became a faithful friend on my journey. Don't ships cross the sea for months today to bring people to Zion? Again and again, I opened individual chapters and made comparisons with today. May this booklet, which started from Zion and which returns to Zion, act as a symbol for the gathering of our scattered scriptures forcibly held by the unworthy. About 2 years later, in the winter month of 1939-1940, Walter Benjamin wrote his 18th thesis über den Begriff der Geschichte after his release from a French internment camp in southern France, to which he had been imprisoned as a German at the beginning of the war. In this fragmentary text, Benjamin famously stated, "Es ist niemals ein Dokument der Kultur, ohne zugleich ein solches der Barbarei zu sein." Thank you.
Thank you so much, Annette, for this fascinating talk, this research logbook, and also all these different case studies of exiles and sanctuaries that you have offered us. And one question I would like to begin with, and I'm watching the chat as well, but while people are putting their questions in the chat, I wanted to ask, I noticed there is a, to me, striking juxtaposition, even already in your title, Secret Wing and On the Move. And I was thinking, you know, the extreme isolation to which Anne Frank and to some extent Mariana Marin were confined, and the being on the move that characterized exiles and characterized modern day asylum seekers seem to be connected phenomena. How does the terror of having to hide connect with the acute sense of having to constantly be on the move?
Well, what I was trying to kind of use as a kind of red thread through my fragments or to my very different, you know, approaches to the subject was really the idea of vulnerability. The vulnerability, which is very interesting to reflect as a figure of not only subjectivity but also as something which is really a shared, I think, existential moment to be addressed and recognized for very, very different, you know, historical epochs, biographies, cultural backgrounds, ideologies, and so on. And I think that's a very, I think for me, rereading Butler was a very stimulating thought to not just address some, you know, the autopoietic dimension, which is really crucial for many of these writings, but also to, seek a deeper kind of connection as an existential dimension for the subject of exile as a subject throughout very different historical phenomena, which of course are very in itself very different, kind of fields. But I really, I'm coming from comparative literature, so I thought, okay, just do something really, just juxtapose many different aspects to really come close to the idea of vulnerability and recognizability of vulnerability as a human right. Because that the vulnerability is also, very, very contemporary question of people who are fleeing countries for various reasons, and who are not only just writers or something, just ordinary people who do something, coming from all walks of life, so to speak.
Yes, thank you so much. And another question I had, I think I've seen that you've engaged with this idea of the archive as event. And I thought in your talk today, where you had very interesting inventories and cross-temporal dialogues with texts from the archives, including under-discussed texts, I thought that showcased the archive as an event. And I think also the way you told us about your research journey. Can you tell us a little bit how the concept of the archive as event emerged, and perhaps also how that concept may be connected to the idea of the sanctuary?
Yeah, I mean, in English, the word event has sometimes it seems to me a very different connotation than the word Ereignis in Germany. So it means, I mean it more like something where something is in the archive is used or readdressed as something where something can, be restated, with a difference, of course, to the actual event, restated and experienced as gains a presence and is somehow alive, and that there are various techniques to kind of, do that. There's even techniques in the digital realm where you kind of make it accessible also for, a rather, non-scientific kind of approach of, kind of stating some facts or excavating some interesting connections, but it's more like that you relate to something like in the theater play of Medea, that you can relate to something, even if it's very different in terms of the background and the time of something you can relate to, and you can experience it in new ways. So that's why I also said, I wanted to, with my last statement on this very difficult day, I wanted to kind of honor the diversity of, very different kinds of archival materials, that they all have the potential to kind of reflect, not only reflect, but approach an event. I mean, you can access the event through the story of Pinsker, or you can access it through Benjamin, you can access it very, very different ways. And if you find the potential of restaging and making it somehow, approachable, also emotionally approachable, that also every kind of fragment kind of encapsulates a story and has a very strong, not only significant relation, but also sometimes in not directly addressing the event. It makes it very approachable, and also it really reveals. I really wanted to also come back to it. Touches you and kind of makes the vulnerability recognizable. That's the important thing. Make the vulnerability recognizable, and give and dignify the people and their experiences by that. I think that's the core idea behind it, also from that writing. So
I was also struck, thinking of the event by the contingencies that you described in your research journey of people, writers, things you came upon, some of whom were connected and some of whom were not, but how you sort of brought them into a new cosmos, if you will. And I thought maybe that's also part of the event, and maybe even in the end, a sanctuary where all of these different voices in a certain constellation come together, that partially you have created, but I think that partly also have suggested themselves to you as you went on that journey.
Yeah, I think the sanctuary is, of course, a very ambiguous space. You know, that's also, I wanted to point that out as a space where things are tentatively safe or secured, but it's potentially always, it is not only a space of conflict, but also it can be also, that's why I used the secret wing, a space where, you know, the communication is, you know, it is a safe space because the communication is cut off, you know, like in the case of Lister and so on. That kind of, so it's a very ambiguous, I think a very ambiguous space, not only politically, but also psychologically and so on. And I think the writing process itself is kind of always revolving in the, at least in and as Exile, revolving about this ambiguity of a space. Yeah, but it's more loose, you know, it's more associated. I think this is only, you know, you can, it's such a fragmented and violent history. I think you can only approach it via fragments, which are kind of come to, you know, build a relation of a fragmentary constellation amongst it. Yeah, I initially thought, oh, what can I do? It's such an open theme. And then the word sanctuary is really a difficult one. And so, yeah, I try to somehow fumble myself through. I've never written a text where I kind of really very strongly addressed the process, but I thought that was very helpful for me to give it that structure, to somehow, because, you know, where do you start, where do you end? And I didn't want to do, because the subject is too serious and personally too touching for me, then I thought I do it in this kind of hybrid way.
Yeah, that's great. And I also, you know, as a fellow comparatist, I like the way you had doing literature in your title. And I think that also kind of refers to this approaching fragmentary writings and then juxtaposing them, putting them in various dialogues together. And to me, doing literature seems to imply reading and writing and thinking about and discussing literature. And yes, I was just fascinated by the juxtapositions that you came up with. And I mean, some of them, as you described, were more maybe coincidence that you came upon them, or I know sometimes when we work on a project, a lot of things will come our way that then somehow neatly fit into the project. But I also noticed that you had a lot of people living in exile or living in a temporary sanctuary, reading other exiles. I think you had quite a few examples of that. And that was very interesting to me, you reading other people. And I was wondering if you could say something perhaps general about what that is like, this intimacy of reading somebody who is in exile or in a sanctuary, reading about somebody else who's in a precarious.
Yeah, like the example of Hélène Cixous. I mean, it was really like she later ironically described that book, but I think it was kind of a founding experience, how to you know, on the one hand, overcome or transcend this experience of exile and then transform it into something else as not a source, but actually as a methodology of her own writing. And that's really interesting to find that position. I mean, it's not like that exile is not, as she said, it's someone who's expelled from a country or something, because that doesn't matter to her anymore, because she doesn't want to belong to a country or nation or something. So she develops this kind of as a precondition for writing. And if you say exile is really the precondition of the writing you're going to do as really an existential kind of undercurrent of, as I said, empowerment, but also vulnerability. If that's the case, of course, you need to kind of not reassure yourself, but you need to kind of compare, or you kind of rewrite your own experience in the experience of others. And that is not like a very, you know, it's more like a trial and error kind of act, and also it can be an act of like, distancing yourself from exiled writers, like many people did from Thomas Mann later and so on. So it's not just a one-way road, but it's really like it's a continuous process of how should I say, of appropriation, I would say, of this kind of nomadic ongoing thing. And on the other hand, one could also more positively state that in a sense where exile is not a force where you're under life threat and so on, it is really a source for being belonging and non-belonging, as a state of existence. You belong to something, but you also, on the other hand, you're not quite belonging. So you have always kind of this kind of half distance to or ambiguity of belongings, which can be painful, but it can be also fruitful. It can be something very painful, like of non-belonging, of like very, like a source of melancholy, but it can also be a source of, empowerment and a strategy of, hybrid, formulation of biography and identity. And I think that's this kind of non-belonging, this ambivalence of belonging, non-belonging is not a condition of just people in exile, but also people who have been migrating, using different languages, starting to write in different languages and so on, being a third or second generation of migration and so on. So it's a long thing, but what was important for me is a kind of theoretical undercurrent that I could reflect the subject of vulnerability and recognizability of vulnerability instead of like identity politics, because that's really an interesting thing. It's not this one identity or group or the other identities of group are on a struggle of self kind of legitimation or survival or something, but it's more crucial that everything has to do with vulnerability also as Butler formulated as a force for empowerment and political activity.
Right, and resilience.
Yeah, resilience, exactly.
Mm-hmm. Well, you were just mentioning that the different kinds of migration or removal that people can experience, and of course, even in your talk, all the different ways of being in exile that you described to us and analyzed are, of course, so vastly different from each other and almost not comparable to each other. But I'm also thinking back of yesterday's talk, Felicitas Hoppe's talk, where she mentioned that being on the move can be a blessing, but also a curse and a burden. Mm-hmm. And I was wondering if, as a scholar and a university professor, you have also been teaching in other places. And lately, of course, we have been prohibited mostly from doing that. And has this being confined to a space? And I think Felicitas Hoppe put this very well yesterday, that all our confinement, of course, also alters the way we theorize sanctuary or confinement. How has that changed for you, and maybe also for your students? I know that's a large question. But
yeah, I think it was a very, in some ways, it was really interesting because in the beginning, some of my colleagues and students and other people had almost a kind of odd kind of relief or almost sarcastic form of, now we can get rid of all these daily, burdens. We can stay at our desk. We can stay here. We can finally really write the book or write something. We have time to do that. We know we have to be stuck in one place. But I think it was just the opposite. I mean, for most of the people, also for me personally, I found it very unproductive, very limiting, very, sometimes even dull, even though I had a lot of, I'm a very privileged person. I can move out, I have a dog and I can walk and I could do many things. But I think even if you really turn to have the time to read and dwell more, that's why I think it was a loss. If I would come back to my talk, it was really a loss of community and the potential of communication. And I think even on a micro level, as for exilees, or on a macro level, as for societies as a whole, or even for inner exile, this lack of communication is really or the potential of communication, self-censorship, and so on, in a political sense, are really very kind of, yeah, depressing and troubling factors. And I think that's also, I think, an aspect of exile which is not really much investigated in, is that aspect of loneliness and lack of communication. And even if you're in a safe space, you know, like talking about house arrest, people are under house arrest, for instance, is a punishment. You know, in other dictatorships, it's a punishment. You are safe in your house, but you can't move out, you can't meet people, and so on. Even in Turkey today, for artists or journalists, and like in Myanmar and so on, house arrest is a very strong punishment. So yeah, it is. This is an ambiguity, you know, in terms of you know, locking you in. You know, essentially locking you in, and the lockdown and locking is a very yeah, it's a very strong intervention in the rights of being free, moving around free, and it is a punishment. So yeah, and that's why I thought also it was interesting for me to come to that Chilean example. You know, they had this was awful propaganda. It was a sanctuary for this ghetto, and the people felt in the book, you see people are in these groups, but they feel like in a prison essentially, even though it's supposed to be a sanctuary and so on. So it's a very ambiguous space.
Yeah, right. Yeah. And I mean, when you say is the punishment of house arrests now, and at the beginning of your talk, we're talking about the exile in the ancient world in Greece, where people they had to leave for 10 years, right? Whereas here's the opposite. People have to stay in one place, but maybe the effect is comparable.
Yeah, I mean, I think that you're right. In Greek, and you know, it has to be very differentiated about the whole story, and for such a long time of this ostracism, because in the beginning, a certain period of time, at least my research led to that, it was actually a quite good arrangement for privileged people to get out for a while, because they could access their fortune. They had a house somewhere, you know, somewhere on an island, and so on. It was more like you have to take a break and you live somewhere else, but they were not, and it was better than, you know, capital punishment or disinheritance of the whole family, you know. And then later it turned into something else. But this, like the whole, I think what was interesting for me to see that it was actually in the beginning, in the essential beginning, this whole idea of ostracism was supposedly a democratic tool to prevent for tyrants to come to power, you know, and how this is also misused politically now. You know, it's like it comes from that antique space, you know, as a, so to speak, democratic tool, but it was, of course, in dictatorship turned into something entirely different. But it had this, and then also later in Greek history, also tyrants turned it around, like with Plutarch and others, turned it around. Ovid later in Norman, and turned it around to something else. But it's very interesting how this kind of concept was really turned into something else later, or in different times. So, but I thought it was just interesting for me to see as a kind of really driving force for the whole plot of Medea. To see that as, and that there were, if you really read it from that perspective, to see all the figures, that they're all nervous, they're all vulnerable about the impending exile, or the future or the past exile, and so on, and the lack of recognition. And it was really interesting for me to just view it from that point of view. I mean, you can say so many things about Medea, but it was like really interesting to it somehow give it one really longer. I mean, you could do many other takes on the really deep historical dimension of that, but I wanted to do one of those because it was really important for me to come to the point of, you know, what it means that the aspect of, you know, that the cutoff of communication in that very community is really important. And that is also a very important factor, because, as I said, the writers in the GDR, the Chilean writers, they had no readers in East Germany. Nobody, you know, it was just later, it was translated and so on. And that's also a really important aspect.
Kind of have no feedback at all. Yeah.
Yeah, no readers. Yeah, not there. Much later then, but not immediately as a group or community you write for as a writer. So.
Yeah, and in that context, I find this idea that of the temporal community also very interesting. That things are written for the future reader. I'm thinking, for example, in Thomas Mann's Dr. Faustus, where Zeitblom says, well, this is written for whenever Europe will be free again, and this can be read by somebody at some point, by an idealized or reader in some future. And I think you've really shown us today here how readers and writers also travel extremely and immensely across space and time to discover, yes, like, as you said, not just people to identify with, but maybe people to dialogue with within that very vulnerability, but also maybe the resilience that they get through that. If I can ask one last question, I know we are a little bit above beyond our time already, but maybe if you could briefly address how you've been teaching, or if you teach exile and ideas of sanctuary or asylum in your classes, in your literature classes.
That's very good question. Really, this is like, I mean, directly not, indirectly yes, because I'm now in a very different field. I think what's interesting for me now is the last quote from Benjamin, because the quote goes on, of course, and he says, like, when you it has a longer, and it says, even in the passing on of these documents of culture, there is a barbarism inscribed. And I'm now doing a lot of research on, now I do a lot of research on, for instance, an archive, very different archive, also Story of Exile. I can only say it to you as an anecdote. I do a lot of practice-based research projects with cultural institutions and so on. And now we do a project with the Ethnological Museum and the Humboldt Forum, and it's on a collection of, I would say, a looted whole cultural treasure, I would say, it was, looted, I think, around the late 1878s by an ethnographer who was sent by the museums in Berlin, Preußischer Kulturbesitz, to go to Alaska and bring back everything he could find, everything, all cultural items a special tribe had there in Alaska, and then with a false justification, progress will come and they will die anyways, so this culture will be erased. So here now in this collection, there are about 50,000 objects, like everything, everything you can imagine. And now so to speak, the whole cultural, historical, so to speak, treasure of this group Chugach, they call themselves Chugach group in Alaska, is somehow in a depot here. And they can't access it. I mean, they can only access it, they came to visit, to see, all the treasures, all the spiritual elements. It's not a culture which has written texts or anything, but their cultural identity is built by oral history and telling stories. And what we do now, we call the project Bring Back Our Stories, and we try to, these objects, we try to retell or find a new way of telling stories with these objects, which are, so to speak, here kind of contained, like many other objects here, like in a depot, and have no life by themselves. And that's a way of, for instance, digital storytelling, which I also do with my colleagues from Harvard. So, but honestly, like returning to this Villa Aurora theme and this exile theme, it's really something I did at the beginning of my, I wouldn't say academic career. I didn't know that I would be a professor for many years, but at the beginning of my research, that was like the initial kind of stimulus for me to work in comparative literature. So it's more a return also methodologically to these subjects. So, but directly, I'm not doing much of that. Indirectly, I do a lot. So.
Yes, it certainly sounds like that with the objects you were just describing, who I think could also be said to be in a very extreme, deep exile by being in Berlin and not being accessed the way they should have been accessed. Well, thank you so much, Professor Lehmann, and thank you so much, Dr. Gordon, for having us today. It was such a pleasure and enormously interesting to listen to you and to dialogue with you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much too. I was really honored, and it was a very emotional kind of procedure for me. So I hope that we can stay in touch, and eventually at one point I come and visit Villa Aurova or Thomas Mann House again to be on the site, because that's important, to feel the energy, to feel the atmosphere and just be there. So wonderful. Thank you for having me. And I think it was a really good, fruitful conversation we had tonight. Thank you so much. Well, this morning. And thanks.
Yes, thank you.
Wonderful. Goodbye. Good night.
Goodbye. Good night.